the debutante ball pictures and everything like that. He's a community figure. I can't recall his name. There was a guy like that in Houston. I'll have to look up his name. African American man. He was just like this guy. He went to all the black debutante balls, and everybody knew him. When he died, they found shoe boxes full of negatives in his closet. Important. I think those have been curated and stored as a history. Anyway, he's like a community figure, right? So what we might call an occupational portrait or environmental portrait. This is a sculptor, right? And there he is in his studio with all of his sculpture. So that's called an occupational portrait. Using existing window light, available light. Or this is an available light portrait in a real world situation. The main lighting is from the neon light. You see his reflection over in the far left, which gives it a certain symmetrical balance. So environmental portraiture using interesting lighting, available light. Know somebody who's into boxing? I don't know if gyms are even open now, but it's a whole fascinating world. And, if you know somebody into that kind of thing, it might make an interesting occupational portrait or environmental portrait. Gyms are interesting places, all the posters on the wall and then the lighting and everything like that. There's Pablo Picasso in his studio. Remember last time we looked at some of his ceramics like you see there in the lower left? But that's a Picasso occupational portrait or environmental portrait in his studio. Notice where he's located, the rule of thirds and all. This is nobody famous, but a kid blowing bubbles, right? That's an interesting kind of a portrait. So environmental portraits, or rather than just having looking at you, having them involved in, like the artists in the 1600s, remember tableau, where they were just looking at you, they were involved in something, they weren't even aware of you. So the bubbles are interesting shapes, right? Repetition and rhythm of the bubble shapes. And then he's all wet. He's a kid playing, head on a diagonal axis. It's all very interesting. Know any musicians? Musicians can be interesting subjects, and they're glad to have their photographs. They'll use them on their websites and things like that. Of course, that guitar is so interesting in terms of shape, right? It also has lines. The F holes, the shape of the guitar, the lines of the strings. So it's a very clear, dominant visual element. You notice where it's located along the rule of thirds. Notice where his head is located, another intersection of the rule of thirds. And the guitar case, an interesting shape, located near one of those rules of thirds. Diagonals of the ladder and of the brace on the wall are always very dynamic. Street musicians, interesting person plays the violin on the street. Interesting characters, right? That's what a lot of Rembrandt did, is find interesting characters. Notice he's not in the center of the frame. So again, simple dark clothing with some pattern, but it's not detracting, and simple background. But you can introduce color and pattern, but you just need to keep it subdued a little bit. Prokofiev, the composer, musician, very modern composition where they placed the main subject way down in the lower left corner. And it's a very modern abstract kind of photograph because it's mostly taken up by the simple dark shape of the piano lid and the stick that holds it up. So it's a very modern kind of abstract photograph. Props can always be interesting. Any kind of prop that you might use. You'll hold a magnifying glass in front of somebody's eye or their mouth, right? Props can be quite interesting. Like this, what do you call that? I'm blanking on what you call that. Tiara, I think. So the shiny metal tiara, right? There's a contrast in the white metal with the dark skin. The shiny metal is complicated in shape. The skin is simple. And so, yeah, props can be interesting and expressive of the person. This is Dorothea Lange, a famous woman photographer from the 1930s. She worked for the WPA during the Depression. But anyway, I've done a couple of these portraits from outside, from people looking out of a window. It frames the subject, it gives it a sense of reality. So I've done more than one portrait of people looking out of a window, because you get the reflection on the glass as well. You don't have to include the face. A portrait can be of just somebody's hands. Dorothea Lange. This is a blind woman in Appalachia doing weaving. Remember last time we looked at looms and weaving? So you have your warp, the vertical strings, and the woof or the weft. There she is weaving. She's blind. She must have some system for knowing which color is which, but she can do everything by feel, right? So that would be occupational portrait. Dorothea Lange. This is from the 60s when the schools were integrated. Your generation really knows nothing about this, but your parents or grandparents, black kids and white kids were not allowed to go to school together. Isn't that ridiculous? So in the 60s, where they forced the schools to integrate and ended the policy of segregation. So the school books on her head, it's unusual, right? It is a reference to that whole fight of integrating the schools. Notice how simple the clothing in the background are to draw focus. Nobody famous, just interesting portrait, tightly cropped, focusing on the eyes and the face. And unusual cropping can be quite interesting, like this couple cropping them half each. Inclusion of a tattoo and a hand can be interesting. Look how close up. Simple, dark clothing. There can be pattern, but it mustn't compete. Dorothea Lange, this is her photograph of a migrant mother and her children from Pomona, California. This photograph actually changed the laws of the land. Largely, when she published this photograph in magazines far and wide, the Social Security Act was passed. This one photograph, as much as anything, caused the passage of the Social Security Act, the social safety net that we all rely on at some point. She had just, so what happened in the Dust Bowl is that over farming in Oklahoma and places, they farmed the land overly much, and there was a drought and the soil blew away. It's called the Dust Bowl. People had to desert their farms and just get in their car and generally head towards California where there could be migrant work. If you could get to California Valley, you could find migrant work, agricultural work, picking produce, and survive. A lot of times the father of the family would go get a pack of cigarettes and never come home, just kind of a nervous breakdown. This mother is all alone with those 3 kids. She's just sold the tire. She got to California, so she sold the tires off of her car. They're living in the car, but she sold the tires off of her car to buy food for another few days for these kids, right? And you can get a sense of the worry and the frustration that she's experiencing. And those kids look tired and defeated. We're not used to seeing kids that way, right? So a good portrait, a good photograph will again cause great empathy and can actually, this one changed the laws of our land. She championed the plight of agricultural workers. It's interesting now with COVID, right? The most essential workers are agriculture. Those are the ones keeping us fed. Yet they suffer the most, they suffer the most. Everybody's dumping on migrant farm workers, Mexican workers, but they're the ones who are feeding you, right? So the texture of that hand that picks that produce, right? Picking produce really is hard on your hands. So another example of existing available light. Always be on the lookout for existing available light. Sally Mann is a photographer. She's close to my age. She's photographed her children and her family life, a lot of us in the 70s and 80s. So the way that children like to act like adults, children are interesting creatures. She had a little bit of trouble for showing her daughter nude on occasion. But, that's somebody's evil imagination. She's their mother, they're her child. It's all innocent. But there's a sensuality about children. Anyone who would get any kind of erotic thrill has a problem, right? A psychological problem that they need help with, right? So there's a difference between sensuality and eroticism. But old hands, young body, right? Interesting contrast about the journey through life, or the way that children want to grow up so fast and act like adults. I think it's a candy cigarette, but she wants to play pretend at being an adult, right? So that's Sally Mann. Children can be fascinating subjects, especially your own children. There's a daddy's girl, even at age 10 or 11 or whatever she's still daddy's girl, right? She makes eye contact with you as if to say, yeah, what? I'm spoiled. What of it? The way children lie around, in a bed and daydream. But yet there's elderly hands embrace. You see, it's framed by a grandmother's hands. And you see a grandmother's head there. Or the things that children get up to. They're paying you no attention. They're blowing bubbles, playing with dolls. Or a grandma's hand on grandbaby's head. So, you don't always have to include the face in a portrait. Or unusual poses like lying in water, in a puddle of water or something like that. A very boyish thing to do. Children lying on a blanket, sleeping, playing at a lake on a pier. So Sally Mann does amazing children's portraits, and they're all her own children, surrounded by Afghans and soft things, blankets and pillows and, soft things. This is a photographer named Cindy Sherman. She's exactly my age. She's been doing nothing but self-portraits for over 30 years. Every photograph she takes is a self-portrait. But she's engaging what we will call tableau. She's acting out. Now, her work is based on gender identity. In this case, she's impersonating, you might say, the Virgin Mary, the way Virgin Mary is represented. So she will do the makeup. Like a film producer or director, she will figure out the costuming, the setting, the makeup. It's like a single frame from a movie. In fact, her first well-known set of photographs was called the Film Stills series. It was acquired by the Museum of Modern Art for like $1 million. This is one of those, but they're like pretend frames from a movie that doesn't really exist, right? A still frame from a movie. And even though this was done in the late 1970s, she's found furniture and done her hair and costuming, everything like from the 1960s. Laura Petrie, her, the decorative housewife. She's waiting nervously for her hubby to come home. You see in the mirror, there's his martini and his smoking jacket ready, and she's got a feather duster in her hand. And she even did the photographs on there of herself to look like hairstyles from the 1960s. This is called pastiche, the French word. It's to simulate something. Pastiche is kind of related to satire, but we're not necessarily laughing. But it's to simulate a different time, a period, something like that. Acting, you might say. Tableau would be the word. She will even use plastic prostheses and wigs and things. Sometimes later work she would create, like paintings from the 1500s or looks at first blush. But then you notice there's like 4 hands coming out of there, which is weird. And then she will use plastic prosthetic breasts and noses and things. but she will play act sort of at different gender types. The idea is that there's only so many